may want to introduce yourself since I figured you'd do a better job than I.
Well, I don't know about that. My name is Charles Sims. I'm with the Department of Applied Economics here at Utah State. I'm actually presenting some work, kind of venturing, taking a field trip outside of Cache Valley today, doing some work that I was working on when I was in Wyoming on coal bed methane development. This, along with some of my co-authors here, we were kind of involved in a similar interdisciplinary group. We were the lone social scientists on the group with a number of wildlife scientists and hydrologists and engineers. A very similar group to this. But this was, I hope that we're going to be a little more interdisciplinary than this group was, because there was a lot of talk about blending everything together. And as you'll see as we go through here, it wasn't as, it wasn't as interdisciplinary as one would have hoped. It's still a lot of the economic analysis being done separately of everything else. So I present this today as kind of a straw man that we can hopefully knock down and improve. The Powder River Basin, for those of you who aren't aware, is in the northeast corner of Wyoming, up near Gillette and Sheridan. It's fairly big, about the size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined. It's characteristic of most of Wyoming. It's generally used for land, for agriculture and ranching. Semi-arid, checkerboard pattern of public lands, state lands, large private landowners. But it's also important because it provides most of the irrigation and most of the drinking water for the region. The BLM is the dominant landowner in the area, but the state lands actually play a pretty important role. I think in 1999, the state director of lands for Wyoming sent out a letter that was basically said, if you want to avoid the federal regulations with coal bed methane, go drill on state lands. We're happy to have you. He was kind of coding it. He called it Go Blue because all the state lands on BLM maps are in blue. So he was trying to be sneaky about it. But the state lands actually play a bigger role than a lot of the federal lands in the basin. Coal beds account for about 7% of the natural gas produced annually within the entire United States. Coal bed methane production is actually kind of emerging more recently as a more economically viable way of producing gas. And because the Powder River Basin happens to have the largest coal reserves in the U.S., we've seen a pretty significant takeoff in that area of coal bed methane development over the past few years. And it's like everything else in Wyoming. It goes in a huge boom-bust cycle, as you see here. I mean, it took off from nearly nothing in the 80s, and over the past decade, it's boomed and then kind of leveled off in the past here. But you know, like with anything with Wyoming, it booms, and then everyone's really, really happy to have it because it supplies tons of tax revenues and income and jobs and whatnot. And then it'll die off, and then we'll wish we'd saved the money, but we never do. So anyway, as you can guess, the people of Wyoming, most of the people of Wyoming are pretty happy to have coal bed methane in the area. Now, the issue that we were looking at was this co-produced water issue. When you're getting the methane out of the coal seams, it's actually in the fissures of the coal seams intermingled with water. So in order to reduce the pressure enough to get the methane to come to the surface, you have to pump all the water out of the coal fissure, and then at that point, you don't really care because you're concerned about the gas, and you just dump it wherever you can get rid of it. It's the byproduct of the production. It's pretty big. It produced, I mean, in yearly or daily estimates of the amount of water produced are over 40 million gallons. So it's a significant amount of water, and thankfully for the gas companies, Montana and Wyoming both, back in '96, decided that this dumping of the water was a beneficial use. So they were all good. Number of concerns with the co-produced water. One is strictly just the quantity of water. As we said, there's tons of water that they're pulling out, so there's concerns about lowering aquifers for private wells or municipal water use. Soil erosion, when you're just dumping all this water on a arid landscape and letting it run to some ephemeral stream somewhere, there's concerns about that. And then disruptions of the natural water flows. are all legitimate concerns that were a little more complicated and a little less understood for us at the time. So we focused more on the water quality aspect. It turns out that a lot of this co-produced water is very high in salinity and sodium. The map there, you can see you probably may not be able to read it, but the purple circles are proportional to the total dissolved solids measures in the river. So for those of you not aware, that would measure the salinity hazard of the river itself. The number in the circle is the sodium absorption ratio. Clearly I'm an economist because I don't know any of this stuff, but it's the sodium absorption ratio, so this would measure the sodium content of the river. The thing that I thought was interesting from an economics perspective is there's clearly some transboundary issues going on here. I mean, 85 to 90% of the gas production goes on in Wyoming, but yet all of the water quality issues are washing into eastern Montana. But I say that, but we didn't really address that issue because we were being funded by the state of Wyoming, obviously, not Montana. So as economists, when we came on board, we thought, well, this has got to be a good thing, right? I mean, we're producing gas, we get water. People in Wyoming are always concerned about water, so this has got to be good. We didn't know any better. We were quickly told, no, this is a problem. These soils, especially in this area, the soils are very high clay content, which happens to make the sodium in the water even more detrimental. In terms of soil, you can kind of get away with using some of this high sodium water for irrigation purposes, but using too much of it will result in what you see in the top picture there, some crusting, reduces conductivity and infiltration. So you have some concerns about your irrigation water being contaminated with this coal bed methane water, and then all of a sudden you realize you've really done a number on your soil. The salinity is also a problem. It can pretty much make most of these soils completely uninhabitable for most of the native species. This is, in the lower picture there, is a stream in northeast Wyoming, a ephemeral stream. The gas company actually built a holding pond on this stream, and we're just filling it. So every day it would spill over and run down the stream. As you can see along the sides there, this had only been going on in this area for about 3 or 4 weeks. And already you can see that the native vegetation around the stream there was already dying off. And quickly you're going to see that those salt intolerant species be replaced with invasive salt tolerant species. So clearly there was a problem here that us economists didn't pick up on right away. But so there's a number of different ways that the gas companies were going about dealing with this excess water, this co-produced water. One was to just discharge it straight into to a stream. Now, from what I understand, I think this past spring, the state of Wyoming officially prohibited this practice, but almost all of the current existing wells were grandfathered in, of course, so it's still going on quite a bit, even though any new wells cannot pump it straight into a river. So the options for any new wells at this point is to apply it directly to crop or rangeland through irrigation. This picture here, what looks like 6 ghosts running across the prairie, is actually massive sprinklers that are spraying all this CBM water just to get rid of it. The other option, store it in holding ponds, which I don't know why they call it holding ponds, because the whole point is they're just trying to get it in a pond so that it will percolate back down, and initially they were telling everyone that it was going to recharge back into the aquifer that they had pulled it from, and then they began to realize, no, that's not happening. It's going completely different places. Very little of it's actually getting back to the aquifer. But this was the other option they had for dealing with the water. A little bit of it is used by these companies. They also have coal mines in the area, so they'll take it and use it for dust control. And then, interestingly enough, some of the gas wells near the town of Gillette were very close to the aquifer that supplies their municipal water. So the state, in the lease for those wells, actually required the companies to re-inject the water back into the aquifer because they were worried about drawing down the aquifer for the city of Gillette. And at this point, it doesn't appear that that's a really cost-effective approach for the gas companies, or at least according to them, it's not cost-effective. Now, it's in the interest of these gas companies to dump the water as fast as they can. So they really want to engage in one of these first three management practices here, because as soon as they dump the water on the soil, they transfer the responsibility for that high sodium water, high salinity water to the state. They've completely absolved themselves of any responsibility once they dump it, either spraying it or putting it into the river, of any responsibility according to state laws. So they have an incentive to really just get rid of it as soon as they can, which means that most of the costs, the environmental costs that come from that dumping are accruing to the people that own the land in the area that the well sits on. So the state's paying for all of the environmental effects. These ranchers, it's kind of increasing now. The ranchers are a tight-knit community up there, and they've kind of spread the word that these coal bed methane drilling rigs are really doing a number on their grazing, and so they've begun to kind of reduce that because they're the ones who have to pay the cost. They can't stick the company with it. So what we would call this as economists, we would refer to this as an externality, because as economists we like to think that as long as you can take the benefits and the costs of whatever you're talking about and they're all incorporated into a market, everything will come out great. But clearly this is some sort of externality in that the coal companies don't have to pay the cost of this cleanup or the cost of this disposal. So this brings up a number of interesting economic questions, either interesting from the perspective of policymakers in the basin or from the perspective of me, I guess. The first one is, what are the positive economic benefits? And these are the ones that policymakers usually want to know about. How many jobs are we getting? What's the increase in income, increase in tax revenues that we're getting from having coal bed methane in the area? But then also, what are the negative environmental impacts of this water being dumped in these areas? Now, if you do have these negative externalities, what's the best way for the state of Wyoming to step in and manage these impacts? So in other words, what's the best way to try to get these coal companies to incorporate those costs that they're kind of dumping onto ranchers and the state? The interesting thing about this is that these effects, the economy is kind of connected in a number of different industries, so trying to regulate one industry means you're going to have impacts that spread to other industries. So we had kind of come up with, decided to follow this computable general equilibrium model, which, for those of you not familiar, general equilibrium theory in economics basically just says that the economy is not one single market. It's clearly a bunch of sub-markets that are all connected to each other, right? So as a household, you supply your labor to some industry that produces some output that may be used to produce some other output that then you may consume, right? So there's connections that go on throughout the market or throughout the economy, and the computable general equilibrium approach is just a way to take that theory and actually apply it. So it's taking a theoretical economic theory and attempting to apply it to real-world situations using real-world economic data. Now, the benefit of this and why it's so popular is that it comes up with really concise, clear impact numbers. So you can clearly say what was what was the income and the prices and productions in these industries before this policy was enacted, and then what was it after. So you get a clear number of this policy affecting both prices, quantities, household incomes, the whole thing. So a real quick short course on CGE models. Households in this case are considered the consumers for our economy. So you can think of the household as either literally a household or just all the individuals in this river basin. Okay. And then the firms are those industries in the basin that are producing something. The utility, so this is kind of the crux of the model here, is that there's actual behavior in this model. It's not just, as they might say on TV, you're not just following the money places. This is actually behavior that's going on in here. What we assume is that you as the household are making decisions about what you want to consume. Right? You're making that based on your idea of utility, which is an abstract economist definition of your own welfare. So if you get welfare from consuming methane gas, you'll consume methane gas. But of course you have to purchase that, so you have to decide how much you want to work, so on and so forth. But you're making a decision about what kind of goods you want to purchase. The firms, in this case, are deciding how much labor they want to employ and then how much output they want to produce. So just keep in mind that in this model, there is decision making that's going on. So the production and the inputs, the labor and the machines and what have you, are all in perfectly competitive economies. So there's none of this. We assume away, as economists, this idea of that supply may not equal demand in all cases. So all markets are clearing. We have prices that are assuming that the supply of labor will equal the demand for labor. We have no unemployment. Okay, so it's a simplification, but it makes it a lot easier than trying to calculate employment all the time. The great thing about the CGE models also is that in addition to keeping up with all these market transactions, they also keep up with government transactions as well. So they can tell you how much a certain industry was taxed by local, federal, and state governments, and then how much of that tax revenue was then redistributed to the households in this basin. So it keeps up with all that as well. So here's a simple kind of stick-and-node model of the economy I'm talking about. This is a regional economy, so the region here is in gray. We've got the firms producing an output that is then consumed by a household, which is you guys as consumers. And you guys decide how much labor you want to supply to this firm. Right? That would be the simple, basic principles of economics design here. If you mix it up a little bit, you could say, well, that output could also be used to produce another output. I mean, easily, you can think of, lumber being used to produce houses, right? But then lumber was produced by some firm before that. So there's these intermediate steps that are going on as well, all producing outputs that are consumed by households. All of these outputs can then be exported to some sort of market outside the Powder River Basin. So, shipping stuff to California can also be shipped overseas. Households, in addition to consuming things that were produced within the basin, can also import stuff. All of the inputs, all of the capital and labor that households within the basin own can also be exported outside the region. So you, as a member or someone living in a town in the basin, could decide I'm going to move outside the basin to go work in Cheyenne or something. And then at the same time, these firms that are in the basin can import their inputs as well, which becomes a big factor in a lot of these cases because most of these companies that come in are not Wyoming companies. So they bring most of their labor with them from Texas, generally. And they set up massive trailer cities around the wells. So this is a big deal because they actually import a lot of the labor in the region. So sometimes it begs the question when you see local politicians come in and say, oh, well, we're going to bring in this industry and it's going to create so many jobs, but does it really? The government is also in the background of all this. They're taxing the firms and the households, and then they will take that tax revenue and redistribute it somehow through public works projects or what have you. So it's maybe not necessarily a monetary redistribution, but they're supplying roads and schools and things like this. So it's a very inclusive model. It keeps up with a lot of stuff, but at the same time, you have to make a lot of assumptions about what the connections are between all these things. Now, the data we're dealing with breaks everything down in very fine detail. So these industry sectors, there's actually 509 of them. So our job is to figure out which of these industries are actually important to the Powder River Basin and which are important for the study we're dealing with. So you can see we've got 3 different sectors that deal with oil and gas, and those just happen to be split out. Everything else is kind of aggregated up to to a larger level. And then all the households in the basin are broken down by their income as well. Of the 2 that we dealt with, you can make the argument that this CBM water was having a number of effects on a number of different industries. To keep it simple, we're just going to focus on the relationship between oil and gas extraction and livestock. Once again, because this was the state of Wyoming and livestock reigned supreme. So they were really concerned about how dumping water on range areas was hurting the forage for livestock. So clearly, as we talked about this so far, we can see that coal bed methane production and development in this basin has positive and negative impacts. Positive, it produces methane gas. Negative, it produces water. So the tricky part right off the bat is figuring out what is the relationship between the gas produced from a well and the water produced from a well. What you see here is this is the dynamics of the water and gas produced from a well over 3 years. Okay, so for the first year, about a year, you're pumping a lot of water out of a well and getting very little gas. After about a year, it starts to pick up, and suddenly you have a much richer mixture of gas to water in what's coming out of your well. And then after about 2.5 years, both gas and water start to drop off. And then usually after about 4 or 5 years, the gas is the well is totally run its course and it's capped. So incorporating this in our model was going to be quite difficult. So we basically broke down into 3 phases. And we said the ratio between gas and water production, you generally have an early phase, a middle phase, and a late phase for each well. So the other tricky part was trying to make the connection between this co-produced water and the impact on the rancher, or the impact on livestock production. So it helps to think that the rancher in this model is really making decisions all the time about how he wants to produce livestock. He can use water, he can use land, he can use feed, all sorts of different inputs to produce his livestock. And he wants to do this to minimize his cost, obviously. So we decided that we were going to incorporate the effect of this CBM water by saying that it decreases the efficiency of water as an input in his production process. So essentially, he now has to use more water to produce the same amount of livestock that he would have before the coal bed methane water was dumped over his grazing area. Okay. So you can think of this as just livestock forage would be reduced, so he has to graze over a larger area. So now that water is a less efficient input in his production process, it makes water relatively more costly compared to everything else that he's using as an input. So he chooses to use less water, but it also drives up the whole his entire cost of production. And he then chooses to reduce his production of livestock, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who you're talking to. You could think of this as ranchers must now purchase feed to supplement the lost grazing that they had due to lost forage, right? So that increases their cost, they produce less livestock. So they lower their production, and this clearly has effects that spread throughout the economy, and it's all these secondary effects that we're trying to keep up with. So if we return back to this stick and node model again, we've got oil and gas here producing, or the oil and gas company are producing the oil and gas. As a byproduct, they also produce this water, okay? The rancher, being our secondary firm here, he will probably consume the oil and gas as well, but he may be negatively impacted by the CBM water. So the balancing comes into, is he better off having a lower price for coal and gas, or is he worse off because he now has to deal with this water? Right? So that's the balancing act we're trying to incorporate in here. So real quick, this is kind of the economic concept of welfare in this measure. So when we get to the end, I'm going to show you a bunch of measures that I contend are, or economists contend are measuring the benefit of a certain policy over another, and it's this welfare measure that we're talking about. It says that households have some sort of welfare utility that they get from consuming all the goods within this basin, but that welfare, they might go out and want to purchase a cow to make ground beef or something. I know that sounds ridiculous, but because we're talking about livestock, they want to go out and purchase that to create ground beef. They have to pay a price for it. They've only got so much income, so they're weighing these purchases versus income decisions to determine how well off they are in each scenario. And each of these is determined by how much they have to pay for certain goods in the economy and what their income level is. So you could ask the question, how do we measure the welfare impact of allowing coal bed methane development in the Powder River Basin? Just a really simple, well, it's not simple, but a really straightforward question. So you would say, suppose that a household faces a certain set of prices and they had a certain income before coal bed methane ever came into the Powder River Basin. Okay, so these prices are P naught and M naught. And you can think of P naught as just the price for everything that they would have consumed. Okay. Then after coal bed methane comes in, this affects the economy to an extent that you now have a new price and a new income. Based on these prices and incomes, you're going to have two different levels of utility. Obviously, is the utility after coal bed methane came in greater than the utility before it came in? Okay? And ideally, you incorporate within that utility measure everything. So this includes things that are within the economy that you're consuming, but also this would include could include environmental quality issues as well. So ideally, economists like to think that this includes everything. The question becomes, can we include everything in these measures, right? But this is the theoretical basis for what we're saying welfare is in this model. So now, we remembered that there was this externality going on with the coal company or the gas companies dumping this water and forcing the ranchers in the state to pay the cost, right? We could ask, there's a number of different ways that we could reduce those impacts on the ranchers and on the state. We could tax the surface disposal of this water, right? We could just say every gallon of water that you drop, you have to pay this tax. We could also just flat out prohibit it, just say that it's illegal. Or we could just go back and supply a subsidy to the ranchers that happen to be negatively impacted. Now, all of these would theoretically reduce the impact on the landowners around the well, right? But they have completely different impacts in terms of the winners and losers, the prices of certain commodities, the income of certain households. Certain low-income households may do better than high-income households. So even though they kind of are all shooting for the same goal, they have completely different incomes or completely different outcomes. So we want to keep up with what each of these are. But we can calculate a welfare measure if you wanted to do a tax policy or a subsidy policy or just prohibiting it. So the economic data include this in case anyone happens to be familiar with CGE models, but it was benchmarked on 2004 M-Plan data, and this M-Plan data set is massive. This is where they have data on every transaction that's occurred between 509 different industries, and then 9 different households, 9 different types of households, and then 4 different levels of government. So it's a massive amount of data that we kind of have to aggregate up or down based on what region we're dealing with and what sectors of the economy we happen to be looking at. And then this SAM is just a massive, you can think of it as just a giant matrix that keeps up with all the connections between each industry and within each household. We also modified this with some additional data from the state and from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And then all the parameters in the model, over 200 of them, have to be calibrated based on this data. So this is, I basically put this slide up here to just kind of convey how time-consuming these types of models are. It's a massive amount of data collection that you have to do, and then a massive amount of model calibration to get to any sort of result that you can feel pretty good that the economy is representing what's really going on. So our policy analysis, the question we wanted to know, obviously, was what are the regional consequences of taxing the output of OGE, which that was the oil and gas extraction sector, if this tax happened to be levied by local governments. This is where we kind of started running out of steam when it came to the incorporating the natural science. We didn't have a really good idea about how badly this coal bed methane water was impacting forage in the area. There was a lot of, depending on who you talked to, it had no effect or it had a huge effect. And it clearly depended on soil types in certain areas and, the amount of water that diluted the coal bed methane water. There was a lot of issues going on. So we decided instead we're just going to consider 6 different scenarios, and that's in this table here. So the first scenario would say that 0 essentially says that coal bed methane water had no detrimental impact on livestock production. And then all the way up to scenario 6, where you would say, this would be our big impact scenario, where we said a 1% increase in the coal bed methane water produced from a well would have a 6% decrease in livestock production efficiency. And then we evaluated each of these scenarios over a range of different tax scenarios, so ranging from 0 to 0.5. So essentially you had no tax, or essentially half of all the production was taxed. And then welfare changes were measured as a difference from the business as usual. So based on 2004, if you did not include a tax versus if you did include a tax in 2005. So this is, the top here is the oil and gas extraction production for different emissions tax rates. As you would expect, obviously, the higher the tax rate, the lower the production in that area. Otherwise, we wouldn't be taxing them. And there wasn't a great deal of difference in those severity scenarios I was talking about, scenarios 1 through 6. There wasn't a great deal of difference. Basically, if you hit them with a tax stick, they're going to reduce their production. This lower one here is the coal bed methane water emissions, which we assumed was proportional to the production. So, of course, it went down as well. This is a graph of the regional livestock production for different rates as well. The interesting thing about this, if the actual impact of the coal bed methane water was low, then the benefits from the tax are low. That makes sense. So that's what you can take away from this graph. The greater the impact, the greater the benefit from enacting this tax, okay? So I know, all that seems pretty obvious, right? Now here are the welfare impacts. So this is how each household in the Powder River Basin was impacted by including this tax on coal bed methane production. Okay? What we see is that if CBM, if that water has no impact on livestock production, then the tax actually makes everyone worse off. Okay? If it has a very high impact, which is the green and red lines up here, then the tax actually benefits most households. This is aggregate households, right? Which, once again, you would expect. The interesting thing here would be you can start kind of seeing what the optimal tax rate might be for each type of scenario, right? So the higher scenarios here, where it was more detrimental to the green lines, you'd want to see a larger tax rate. If it was less detrimental, you'd see a lower tax rate. Okay. So this is the welfare impacts when they have basically no detrimental impact. So CBM water doesn't do anything to livestock production. What you see here is that for almost every type of household, they're worse off with the tax, except for the two low-income households here, which are the red and blue lines. And this simply represents the fact that even though it doesn't affect the livestock industry, the local government is pulling in tons of tax revenue. And these low-income households happen to receive government assistance as a larger proportion of their income. So they're better off if you tax anything. They're better off because it's a larger proportion of their income. And when this coal bed methane water had a huge impact on livestock production, everybody's better off with the tax. Okay, but we see that the high-income households do a lot better than the low-income households. And once again, you can kind of see the differences in what people might consider to be the optimal tax rate here. High-income households would want a tax rate somewhere around 0.3. Low-income households would really want it to be a little bit less. Okay. Now, the interesting dynamics and kind of the interesting results start to come in when you say, well, let's not look at either extreme, but let's say that the impacts of this coal bed methane water were kind of somewhere in the middle. And then you see for a very low tax rate, almost every household does better. But once the tax rate hits a certain level, the high-income households do worse, low-income households happen to do better. So there's distributional issues going on here all the time with this tax rate. And clearly you can think that these high-income households are going to have the bigger push on what the tax rate will be when it comes time to decide that. So the interesting question from an economist's perspective is not necessarily what are the welfare changes, but what drives these welfare changes. And in an economy, there's both direct and indirect effects, obviously. The direct effects here, when you tax the coal and gas industry, you see an increase in the price of coal and gas, clearly, right? You also decrease the price of livestock because you've now reduced the amount of coal bed methane water being dumped on the fields, and you've increased their productivity. Now, this has income effects as well that you have to keep up with. So you've now taxed the coal and gas industry. They've now reduced their production. Now they lay off workers. They close shut down wells, everything else, right? This filters out through the economy as a decrease in wages for everyone in the basin, and then also an increase in the rental rate of capital. So you can think about an increase in the rental rate of capital would be the interest rate you would have to get on a loan if you went to a local bank. Okay, so it actually makes you worse off as well. So there's indirect price effects too that we have to keep up with. Those sectors that happen to be more capital intensive, so the ones that use more machinery versus labor, they are going to see an upward pressure on their unit cost and prices because the rental rate of capital increased. So this is how much they would have to pay for a machine, essentially. The other sectors in the economy that happen to use more labor versus machinery will see a downward pressure on their cost and prices. Sectors that happen to use oil and gas as another input in their production, they'll also see an upward pressure on their price. And then sectors that use livestock as an input into their production process will see a downward pressure on price. So overall, what we saw in the Powder River Basin, turns out most of the oil and gas happens to be one of the most capital-intensive industries in the basin. So when you taxed oil and gas, most of the other sectors in the region actually saw a price decline because they were relatively more labor-intensive in the basin. So the welfare losses that we see in the basin here, it's kind of a tricky two-part thing here. They had declining wages, which lowered their income. They also had a decrease in their overall prices that they were facing. So the question became, which one of those two things balanced out? So whenever you saw a welfare loss, you saw that those households took a bigger hit in their income than they gained in the price decrease. Okay, so the differences that you would see among different households would just say that those households happen to have different compositions of capital and labor, which is just an economic way of saying some people happen to have higher paying jobs and can invest more in the financial market and other households cannot. So this is the other question that a lot of policymakers will ask. Yes, you tax the coal and gas industry and you increase their production, but what does this do to tax revenues? If one of our major tax revenue sources is the coal and gas industry in this region and you've just reduced their production, does that not decrease your tax revenues? It turns out that the coal and gas industry is willing to suck up quite a bit of a tax impact. So even though you tax them, they don't reduce their production by that much, and you still see a huge increase in the local government revenues in that basin. So the take-home point here is local government has an incentive to tax no matter what. That's not an overarching political statement. That's just a statement about the Powder River Basin. So the take-home points, a tax on this sector will have positive impacts only if the water has a negative impact on livestock production. Low-income households are going to experience welfare gains no matter what. That's simply because they happen to receive more of those government revenues as a reimbursement later. That happens to be a bigger part of their income. Regional wages fall, but the rental rate of capital rises, and this happens to actually fall out into a greater decrease in prices. So a lot of households actually benefit because their incomes go down by less than the price. And then in all scenarios, an increase in local government tax revenues due to the fact that we're taxing this industry. Extensions, clearly we've focused in on one sector. This impact could have spread through numbers of sectors. And this would require something that we kept saying we were going to do, but we never really got around to doing, which was working with engineers and hydrologists and learning exactly which scenario of those 6 that we were talking about are we dealing with. And then based on that and based on the location of a well compared to a rancher or an industry, how do hydrologic flows impact someone's impact versus another person's impact who happens to be right next to it. So for instance, a lot of these models, there's a good example of this type of model being applied to a fishery off the coast of Alaska. And in addition to that big stick and node thing that I popped up here, all the interconnections of the economy, they happen to have another one of those that happens to be all the interconnections of the food web, essentially. So they would follow, they would say, we're going to follow the fact that a seal preys on this certain type of fish, and then that seal is preyed upon by a killer whale. So they follow all those connections as well, and then map that onto this massive economy. It really gets at a better question of which industries are impacted, and then how much are they impacted. So you're not just kind of coming in and saying, or you have the case where an industry might come in and have the incentive to come in and say, look, we're impacted too. You need to include us in this. We can actually hopefully come back and say, well, it kind of looks like you're not. So anyway, that's what I would like to see come out of this, would be some sort of massive connection with hydrologic flows that would connect certain industries and certain sources of this coal bed methane water production. And that's all that I have.